The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Millbrook, but Zephyr Castellanos knew that today, those shadows would be filled with more than just darkness. Standing atop the water tower that had become their makeshift command post, she surveyed the barricades her people had spent 3 sleepless nights constructing. Below, 47 survivors moved with the desperate efficiency of those who knew this might be their last stand. The undead horde that had consumed 3 neighboring towns was less than 6 hours away, and for the first time in the 8 months since the outbreak began, humanity wasn't running. Zephyr's weathered hands gripped the radio as static crackled through the morning air. "Phoenix Base, this is Millbrook. We're holding position." Her voice carried the weight of command, though she'd never asked for it. Leadership had fallen to her when the military abandoned their sector, leaving behind only empty promises and a handful of weapons that wouldn't last the day. The response came through broken and distant. Other survivor enclaves across the region were making similar stands. Today wasn't just about Millbrook, it was about proving that humanity still had fight left in it. In the town square below, Kairos Thorne methodically checked his rifle for the 100th time. The former park ranger had become their best marksman, his steady hands and patient demeanor making him invaluable in their guerrilla strikes against smaller undead groups. But this was different. Intelligence reports suggested nearly 3,000 infected were shambling toward their position, drawn by the smoke signals they'd been sending to coordinate with other survivor groups. Kairos had done the math. Even with perfect accuracy, they didn't have enough ammunition to stop what was coming. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up to see Lyra Blackwood emerging from the medical station they'd established in the old library. Her surgical scrubs were stained with blood from treating the wounded who'd arrived throughout the night, refugees from the towns that had already fallen. Her dark eyes met his, and in them he saw the same grim determination that had kept her working 18-hour days since joining their group. "The wounded are stable," she reported, though they both knew that stability was a relative term when antibiotics were running low and proper surgical equipment was non-existent. Across town, in what had once been Millbrook Elementary School, Orion Valdez was making final adjustments to their most desperate gambit. The former demolitions expert had spent the last week rigging the school's basement with every explosive they could scavenge. If the barricades fell, when they fell, the plan was to lure as many infected as possible into the building before bringing it down. It was a suicide mission disguised as strategy, and everyone knew it. Orion's hands moved with practiced precision as he connected the final detonator, his mind already calculating blast radiuses and casualty estimates. The radio crackled again, this time with a transmission that made everyone freeze. "All stations, this is Colonel Reeves, 82nd Airborne. We're inbound to your position with air support. Hold the line for 6 more hours." Zephyr felt her heart skip as she grabbed the handset. Military support had been a fantasy for so long that hearing it felt like a cruel joke. But the voice was clear, professional, and carried the kind of authority that couldn't be faked. "Millbrook copies, Colonel. We'll be here." As word spread through their makeshift fortress, something shifted in the air. The desperate resignation that had settled over the group began to transform into something harder, more focused. They weren't just making a last stand anymore, they were buying time for rescue. Children who had learned to move silently through rubble began helping adults reinforce firing positions. Elderly survivors who had been conserving their strength for evacuation now picked up weapons with trembling but determined hands. The first distant moans echoed across the morning landscape, carried on a wind that seemed to whisper of death and decay. But for the first time since the world had ended, the living weren't listening to whispers of defeat. They were writing their own story, one bullet at a time, one barricade at a time, one heartbeat at a time. The shadows were coming, but today humanity would cast shadows of its own. The infected appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon, like storm clouds gathering at ground level. Through her binoculars, Zephyr watched the leading edge of the horde crest the hill 2 miles out, their shambling forms creating a grotesque wave that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. She'd seen large groups before, but nothing like this. The infected moved with the inexorable patience of the tide, and just like the tide, they would eventually reach every corner of their small sanctuary. "Contact 2 miles and closing," she radioed to the defensive positions scattered throughout the town. The response was immediate, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied, the soft whispers of final prayers, and the gentle sobbing of those who knew they might not see another sunset. But underneath it all was something new, something that hadn't existed in their previous encounters with the undead: hope. The promise of military support had changed everything, transforming their desperate last stand into a calculated holding action. Kairos had positioned himself in the bell tower of the old Methodist church, giving him a commanding view of the main approach routes. Through his scope, he could see individual faces among the infected, or what remained of faces after months of decay and violence. Some still wore the tattered remnants of their former lives. A postal worker's uniform, a child's school backpack, a wedding dress stained with unspeakable things. He forced himself to remember that these had once been people with hopes and dreams, but that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not today. The first defensive line consisted of overturned cars and shipping containers arranged in a funnel pattern designed to channel the infected into predetermined kill zones. Lyra had argued against the strategy, pointing out that it would also trap any survivors trying to escape, but Zephyr had been adamant. There would be no retreat this time. They would hold their ground or die trying, because running had only led to more death, more loss, more communities torn apart by fear and desperation. In the school basement, Orion made his final preparations with the methodical calm of someone who had accepted his fate. The explosive charges were connected to a dead man's switch that he would carry with him to the surface. If the infected breached their final defensive line, he would lead them into the building and ensure that at least a significant portion of the horde would be eliminated. It wasn't a perfect plan, but perfection was another luxury they couldn't afford. The radio crackled with updates from other survivor enclaves across the region. Phoenix Base reported heavy contact but was holding. Sanctuary Hills had gone silent an hour ago, their last transmission a desperate plea for ammunition. Iron Ridge was requesting immediate evacuation for their wounded, but there was nowhere safe to take them. The coordinated resistance that had seemed so promising in the planning stages was already beginning to fracture under the reality of combat. As the infected drew closer, their individual moans began to merge into a continuous, soul-crushing wail that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The sound had a psychological effect that went beyond mere noise. It was the voice of humanity's failure, the collective scream of a species that had lost its way. But the defenders of Millbrook had heard that sound before, and they had learned to answer it with something stronger: the crack of rifle fire, the whistle of arrows, and the defiant shouts of those who refused to surrender. Zephyr climbed down from the water tower and took her position at the main barricade, her assault rifle loaded with their precious remaining armor-piercing rounds. Around her, the other defenders settled into their positions with the grim efficiency of veterans. They had learned hard lessons in the months since the outbreak began, paid for in blood and measured in the graves of friends who hadn't been fast enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to survive. The infected were close enough now that individual details became visible. The way their clothes hung in tatters, the unnatural angles of broken bones that hadn't healed properly, the dark stains that marked their feeding frenzies. But most disturbing of all were their eyes, not the vacant stare of mindless beasts, but something that suggested a terrible awareness, as if some fragment of their former humanity remained trapped inside, screaming silently as their bodies committed unspeakable acts. Range 800 meters and closing, Kairos reported from his perch. His voice was steady, professional, but Zephyr could hear the underlying tension. They all knew that once the shooting started, there would be no going back. This wasn't a skirmish or a raid. This was war in its most primal form, the living against the dead, civilization against chaos, hope against despair. The first shot rang out at exactly 11:47 a.m., Kairos's rifle speaking with the authority of a man who had never missed when it mattered. The lead infected, a former construction worker still wearing his hard hat, dropped instantly, the .308 round punching through his skull and spraying the creatures behind him with dark, congealed blood. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for, and within seconds the morning air erupted with the thunder of coordinated gunfire. Zephyr's position at the main barricade gave her a perfect view of their carefully planned killing field. The infected funneled through the gaps in their defensive line exactly as predicted, their shambling forms creating perfect targets for the defenders positioned in elevated positions throughout the town. But even as bodies began to pile up, more kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades with a mindless determination that made them so terrifying. The sound of combat was unlike anything the survivors had experienced before. Previous encounters had been brief, desperate affairs, quick strikes followed by immediate retreat. This was sustained warfare, the kind of prolonged engagement that tested not just marksmanship but endurance, nerve, and the ability to keep fighting when every instinct screamed to run. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the sickly sweet stench of decay, creating an atmosphere that seemed to coat the inside of their lungs with death. Lyra had established her medical station in the town hall, close enough to the fighting to provide immediate aid but protected enough to keep her patients safe from stray rounds. The first wounded arrived within minutes of the engagement beginning, a young woman named Sage who had taken shrapnel from a ricochet, and an older man whose rifle had misfired, burning his hands. But these were minor injuries compared to what Lyra knew was coming. In sustained combat, the wounded always outnumbered the dead. From his position in the church tower, Kairos methodically worked his way through his ammunition, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. He had learned to read the infected's movement patterns, to predict where they would be rather than where they were. His rifle had become an extension of his will, each trigger pull a small victory against the chaos that had consumed the world. But even with his skill, he could see that they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The infected had reached the first barricade, their clawing hands and snapping teeth finding purchase on the overturned cars and concrete barriers. Some of the defenders had switched to melee weapons to conserve ammunition, and the sound of metal striking bone added a new rhythm to the symphony of violence. Zephyr watched a teenager named River, barely 18 and fighting with a crowbar, hold his section of the line against 3 infected simultaneously, his movements fluid and desperate. The radio brought news from other fronts that ranged from encouraging to devastating. Phoenix Base reported successful repulsion of their first wave but warned of a second, larger group approaching from the east. Iron Ridge had fallen silent completely, their last transmission cut off mid-sentence in a way that suggested the worst. But Sanctuary Hills had somehow managed to break their siege, their defenders successfully executing a fighting withdrawal to a more defensible position. As the morning wore on, the character of the battle began to change. The initial shock and adrenaline gave way to the grinding reality of sustained combat. Weapons jammed at crucial moments, ammunition ran low, and fatigue began to take its toll on defenders who had been operating on minimal sleep for days. But something else was happening too. The survivors were adapting, learning, becoming more efficient killers with each passing hour. Orion emerged from the school basement to take his position at the secondary defensive line, the dead man switch secured to his belt like a talisman of last resort. His demolitions expertise had proven invaluable in creating improvised explosive devices from household chemicals and scavenged materials, and the sound of his homemade grenades added punctuation marks to the ongoing firefight. Each explosion cleared a small space in the infected ranks, but that space was always quickly filled by more shambling forms. The infected had begun to exhibit behavior that troubled the defenders. Rather than simply rushing forward in a mindless wave, they seemed to be learning from their losses, finding new approaches and adapting their tactics. Some climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades to reach higher positions, while others began to circle around the flanks, testing for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter. It was a level of coordination that suggested something more than mere instinct was driving them. Zephyr found herself thinking about the military support that had been promised, wondering if Colonel Reeves and his airborne unit were real or just another cruel hope in a world that had become expert at crushing hope. The radio had been silent for over an hour, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were truly on their own. But even if help never came, even if this was indeed their last stand, she was proud of what they had accomplished. For the first time since the outbreak began, humanity wasn't running. By noon, the battle had settled into a rhythm of violence that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. The infected came in waves, each surge testing a different section of the defensive perimeter, and the survivors responded with the coordinated efficiency of a machine built for killing. But machines break down under stress, and Zephyr could see the signs of impending failure in the faces of her people. Ammunition was running critically low, several defensive positions had been abandoned due to casualties, and the infected were beginning to exploit gaps in their lines. The medical station had become a scene from a nightmare, with Lyra working frantically to treat wounds that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. A defender named Atlas had lost 3 fingers to an infected bite before his teammates could pull him clear, while another survivor called Iris was suffering from severe blood loss after taking a piece of shrapnel to the thigh. But the most disturbing cases were those who had been bitten. 5 people so far who now faced the terrible choice between immediate amputation and certain infection. Kairos had been forced to abandon his position in the church tower when a group of infected managed to breach the building's lower level. His retreat to a secondary position on the roof of the hardware store gave him a different perspective on the battle, and what he saw was deeply troubling. The infected weren't just attacking randomly anymore, they were coordinating their assaults, with some groups creating diversions while others probed for weaknesses. It was as if some collective intelligence was directing their movements. The sound of approaching aircraft broke through the constant noise of combat like a thunderclap of hope. Zephyr looked up to see 3 military helicopters approaching from the south, their rotors beating the air with the promise of salvation. But as they drew closer, she could see that they weren't the massive transport helicopters she had expected. These were attack birds, bristling with weapons and moving with the predatory grace of hunters seeking prey. "Millbrook, this is Falcon Leader," the radio crackled with a voice that carried the calm authority of professional military training. "We have eyes on your position and are beginning our attack run. Keep your heads down and maintain your defensive positions." The helicopters swept over the town in a formation that spoke of countless hours of training and combat experience, their door gunners already engaging targets on the outskirts of the infected horde. The effect was immediate and devastating. The heavy machine guns mounted on the helicopters tore through the infected ranks like a scythe through wheat, creating corridors of destruction that temporarily relieved pressure on the most threatened sections of the defensive perimeter. But even as bodies fell in heaps, more infected continued to pour over the hills, their numbers seemingly endless. The air support was welcome, but it wasn't going to be enough to end the siege. Orion watched the helicopter attack from his position near the school, his finger resting lightly on the dead man's switch that would detonate his carefully placed charges. The explosives represented their final option, a last desperate gambit that would take him and hopefully hundreds of infected with him. But seeing the military helicopters gave him hope that perhaps that sacrifice wouldn't be necessary. Perhaps they could actually win this fight. The infected had begun to adapt to the aerial assault, some seeking cover under overhangs and in buildings while others continued their relentless advance toward the defensive lines. Their ability to learn and adjust their tactics was becoming more apparent with each passing hour, and it raised disturbing questions about the nature of the infection itself. Were they dealing with mindless zombies or something far more intelligent and dangerous? Lyra had been forced to make the hardest decision of her medical career when a young defender named Phoenix arrived at her station with a bite wound on his arm. The infection spread quickly, and amputation was the only option if he was going to survive. But their medical supplies were limited, and she wasn't sure she could perform the surgery under these conditions. Phoenix made the choice for her, grabbing a hacksaw from the toolkit and asking her to help him do what needed to be done. The radio brought updates from the helicopter pilots that painted a grim picture of the larger situation. The infected horde was even larger than initial estimates had suggested, with satellite imagery showing additional groups converging on their position from multiple directions. Other survivor enclaves were reporting similar massive assaults, suggesting that this was a coordinated offensive rather than random migration. The helicopter pilots reported what ground observers had feared. This wasn't a random convergence of infected, but something that resembled a coordinated assault on multiple survivor settlements simultaneously. "Millbrook, be advised," Falcon Leader's voice crackled through the radio, "we're seeing similar attacks on Phoenix Base, Iron Ridge, and at least 6 other locations. This appears to be a planned offensive." Zephyr felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The implications were staggering. If the infected were capable of coordinated attacks across multiple locations, it meant they possessed a level of intelligence and organization that fundamentally changed everything humanity thought it knew about the outbreak. The shambling hordes they had been fighting for months might have been evolving, learning, becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The battle intensified as the afternoon wore on, with the infected pressing their assault from multiple directions simultaneously. The eastern barricade, defended by a group of survivors led by a former police officer named Caspian Reeves, came under particularly heavy pressure. Wave after wave of infected threw themselves against the hastily constructed barriers, their bodies piling up in grotesque mounds that the next wave used as stepping stones to reach higher ground. From her medical station, Lyra could hear the sounds of combat growing closer. The wounded were arriving faster than she could treat them, and she had been forced to make the kind of triage decisions that would haunt her for the rest of her life, assuming she lived long enough to be haunted. A teenager named Sage had taken a bite to the shoulder and was begging for amputation, while an elderly man called Sterling was bleeding out from a wound that would require surgery she couldn't perform under these conditions. The helicopters continued their attack runs, but their ammunition was finite, and the pilots were reporting mechanical issues from the sustained combat operations. One of the aircraft, Falcon 3, had taken small arms fire from infected who had somehow acquired weapons, forcing it to break off its attack and return to base for repairs. The remaining 2 helicopters were doing their best to provide support, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Kairos had moved to a new position on the roof of the bank, giving him a clear field of fire across the town square where the infected were beginning to mass for what looked like a final assault. His ammunition was down to his last magazine, and he was saving each round for shots that would count the most. Through his scope, he could see infected that moved differently from the others. Ones that seemed to be directing the movements of their companions, pointing toward weak spots in the defenses and coordinating attacks. The sound of explosions from the direction of the school told everyone that Orion had begun detonating his charges, but not in the final suicide blast they had all expected. Instead, he was using them tactically, timing the explosions to disrupt infected formations and create temporary barriers of rubble and debris. It was a brilliant adaptation of their desperate plan, buying them precious time while conserving their ultimate weapon for when it would be most needed. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when the infected launched what could only be described as a coordinated final assault. Unlike their previous attacks, this one came from all directions simultaneously, with different groups moving in patterns that suggested careful planning and tactical awareness. The defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their carefully prepared defensive positions suddenly becoming isolated islands in a sea of undead. Zephyr had been forced to abandon the main barricade when it was overrun, falling back to the secondary defensive line with the handful of survivors who had managed to escape the collapse of their eastern flank. The retreat had been costly. They had lost Caspian and at least 6 other defenders, along with most of their heavy weapons and remaining ammunition. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she could see the fear beginning to replace determination in the eyes of her people. The infected had breached the town's outer defenses and were now fighting in the streets, their shambling forms moving between buildings with a purpose that was deeply unsettling. Some carried crude weapons, pieces of rebar, broken glass, even firearms taken from fallen defenders, while others moved with a coordination that suggested they were following orders from some unseen commander. The line between the living and the dead was becoming blurred in ways that went beyond mere infection. Lyra's medical station had become a fortress under siege, with wounded defenders helping to barricade the doors and windows while she continued to work on the most critically injured. The sound of infected clawing at the walls was a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. She had managed to save Phoenix's arm through a hasty amputation, but 3 other bite victims had chosen to take their own lives rather than risk turning and endangering their companions. From his position on the bank roof, Kairos could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding below. The infected had taken control of roughly half the town, and their numbers seemed to be growing rather than diminishing despite the heavy casualties they had suffered. More disturbing still, he could see infected that appeared to be setting up defensive positions of their own, using overturned cars and debris to create barriers that protected them from the helicopter gunships. The radio brought news that shattered what remained of their hope. "All stations, this is Colonel Reeves. We're being forced to withdraw due to fuel constraints and mechanical failures. Additional support is en route, but ETA is unknown. You're on your own for now." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static and the sound of distant gunfire. The military support they had counted on was abandoning them, just like every other promise of help they had received since the outbreak began. Orion had retreated to the school's upper floors, his remaining explosives rigged to bring down the entire building if the infected managed to breach the lower levels. The dead man's switch felt heavy in his hand, a constant reminder that he held the power to take hundreds of infected with him when the time came. But he wasn't ready to give up yet, not while there were still people fighting, still hope that they might somehow survive this nightmare. The infected had begun to exhibit new behaviors that defied everything the survivors thought they knew about the outbreak. Some were using tools, others were communicating through a series of grunts and gestures that resembled a primitive language, and a few seemed to be showing tactical awareness that bordered on military training. It was as if the infection wasn't just reanimating dead tissue, but was actively improving upon it, creating something that was more than human rather than less. The battle had devolved into a series of desperate last stands, with small groups of survivors holding isolated positions throughout the town while the infected moved between them like a tide that rose and fell with deadly precision. The coordinated defense that had seemed so promising that morning had collapsed into chaos, leaving each group to fight for survival on their own terms. As darkness began to fall, Zephyr found herself thinking about the children they had evacuated to the underground shelter beneath the library. If the town fell, when it fell, those children would be the only survivors, hidden away with enough supplies to last perhaps a week. It wasn't much of a legacy, but it was something. Humanity would continue, even if only in the form of a handful of frightened children hiding in the dark. The sound of approaching engines broke through the constant noise of combat, but these weren't the familiar rotors of helicopters. Instead, the deep rumble of heavy vehicles was approaching from the south, accompanied by the distinctive whine of tracked vehicles moving at high speed. Someone was coming, but whether they represented salvation or just another threat remained to be seen. The convoy that emerged from the southern approach consisted of 6 heavily armored vehicles moving in formation, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk like beacons of hope. But as they drew closer, Zephyr could see that these weren't military vehicles. They were civilian trucks and buses that had been modified with armor plating and weapon mounts, driven by survivors who had somehow managed to organize themselves into a mobile fighting force. The lead vehicle's loudspeaker crackled to life with a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Millbrook Defenders, this is Commander Thane Blackwater of the Northern Alliance. We're here to extract survivors and provide covering fire for evacuation. Prepare for immediate withdrawal to designated rally points. The announcement sent a surge of hope through the beleaguered defenders, but it also raised questions about who these people were and what they wanted in return for their help. The infected responded to the new arrivals with a coordination that was both impressive and terrifying. Rather than simply rushing toward the vehicles, they began to reposition themselves to create ambush points and establish overlapping fields of fire. Some infected took cover behind buildings while others moved to flank the convoy, their movements suggesting a level of tactical awareness that made Zephyr's blood run cold. Whatever the infection had become, it was no longer the mindless plague they had been fighting for months. Lyra began the desperate process of preparing her patients for evacuation, knowing that some were too badly wounded to survive the journey but unable to abandon them to the infected. The choice was agonizing: save those who could be saved and leave the rest, or try to save everyone and risk losing them all. Phoenix, despite his recent amputation, insisted on helping to carry the stretchers, his determination a reminder of the courage that had kept them fighting this long. The Northern Alliance vehicles had formed a defensive perimeter around the town hall, their mounted weapons creating interlocking fields of fire that temporarily pushed back the infected advance. But Zephyr could see that this was a temporary reprieve at best. The convoy's ammunition was limited, and the infected were already adapting to their tactics, using the growing darkness to mask their movements and approach from unexpected angles. Kairos had made his way down from the bank roof and was now fighting alongside the Alliance soldiers, his marksmanship skills proving invaluable in the close-quarters combat that had developed around the evacuation point. The Alliance fighters were professionals, their movements coordinated and their equipment well-maintained, but they were clearly outnumbered and operating under severe time constraints. Every minute they remained in Millbrook increased the risk that they would be overwhelmed. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency, but it was clear that not everyone would make it out. The infected had managed to cut off several groups of survivors, trapping them in buildings throughout the town while the main evacuation proceeded. Zephyr found herself facing the hardest decision of her life: order the convoy to leave while they still could, or risk everyone's lives trying to save those who were trapped. Orion had rigged the school with enough explosives to level several city blocks, but he was reluctant to detonate them while friendly forces were still in the area. The dead man's switch had become a symbol of their desperation, a final option that would ensure the infected paid a heavy price for their victory. But as he watched the evacuation proceed, he began to hope that perhaps his sacrifice wouldn't be necessary after all. The radio brought updates from other survivor enclaves that painted a mixed picture of the larger battle. Phoenix Base had successfully repelled their attackers with help from another Alliance convoy, while Iron Ridge had been completely overrun, its defenders either dead or missing. The coordinated infected assault was succeeding in some areas while failing in others, suggesting that whatever intelligence was directing them was still learning, still adapting to human tactics and responses. Commander Blackwater's voice cut through the chaos with an announcement that changed everything. All units, be advised. We have confirmation that the infected are being directed by a central intelligence. Satellite imagery shows command and control nodes in major population centers. This is not a random outbreak, it's an invasion. The implications were staggering, transforming their understanding of the conflict from a battle for survival into something that resembled a war between species. As the last of the wounded were loaded into the evacuation vehicles, Zephyr took one final look at the town that had been their home for the past 8 months. The infected had taken control of most of the buildings, their shambling forms moving through the streets with a purpose that was no longer mysterious. They weren't just seeking food or following instinct, they were claiming territory, establishing control, building something that resembled a society of the dead. The convoy began to move, its vehicles forming a protective formation around the buses carrying the evacuated survivors. But as they prepared to leave Millbrook behind, explosions began to rock the town as Orion finally triggered his charges. The school disappeared in a massive fireball that lit up the night sky, taking with it hundreds of infected and serving as a final defiant gesture from humanity's defenders. The living had lost this battle, but they had made the dead pay dearly for their victory. The convoy moved through the night like a funeral procession, its headlights cutting through darkness that seemed to press against them with malevolent intent. In the back of the lead bus, Zephyr sat among the survivors they had managed to save, 37 people out of the 47 who had made their stand in Millbrook. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving, but she tried to focus on the lives they had preserved rather than the ones they had lost. Lyra worked tirelessly in the makeshift medical bay that had been set up in one of the trucks, treating wounds and monitoring the bite victims who had chosen amputation over infection. Phoenix sat quietly in the corner, his bandaged stump a reminder of the prices they had all paid for their continued existence. The young man's eyes held a mixture of pain and determination that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable horror. Commander Blackwater's voice came over the radio with updates that painted a grim picture of the larger conflict. The coordinated infected assault had succeeded in overrunning 12 survivor settlements while failing to take 8 others. The pattern suggested that whatever intelligence was directing the infected was conducting a systematic campaign to eliminate organized human resistance, testing defenses and learning from both successes and failures. Kairos rode in the gun turret of one of the escort vehicles, his rifle ready as he scanned the darkness for signs of pursuit. The infected had shown an disturbing ability to track moving vehicles, and several convoys had been ambushed by groups that seemed to anticipate their routes. The night was full of sounds that might have been whined through abandoned buildings or the moans of the undead. In this new world, the difference was often academic until it was too late. The Northern Alliance base turned out to be a converted shopping mall surrounded by elaborate fortifications that spoke to months of careful planning and construction. As their convoy passed through the outer checkpoints, Zephyr could see that this wasn't just a survivor enclave, it was the foundation of something larger, an attempt to rebuild civilization in the shadow of the apocalypse. Gardens grew on the mall's roof, workshops had been established in former retail spaces, and children played in areas that had once been food courts. But even here, in this bastion of human achievement, the signs of the ongoing war were evident. Guard towers bristled with weapons, patrols moved constantly along the perimeter, and the faces of the residents carried the haunted look of people who had seen too much death. The infected might not have taken this place, but they had certainly marked it, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The debriefing session that followed their arrival revealed the true scope of the crisis they were facing. The infected weren't just evolving, they were being directed by something that possessed strategic intelligence and long-term planning capabilities. Satellite imagery showed massive infected populations moving in coordinated patterns across the continent, while intercepted communications suggested that some infected retained enough of their former intelligence to operate complex equipment. Zephyr found herself appointed to the Alliance's Strategic Planning Committee, her experience in defending Millbrook making her valuable despite the ultimate failure of their mission. The other committee members were survivors from settlements across the region, each bringing their own hard-won knowledge of infected tactics and capabilities. Together they began to plan not just for survival, but for the long campaign that would be necessary to reclaim their world. As the weeks passed, news filtered in from other parts of the country and the world. The infection had spread globally, but humanity was fighting back with increasing coordination and effectiveness. Military units that had initially been overwhelmed were regrouping and adapting their tactics, while civilian survivors were organizing into larger and more effective resistance movements. The war was far from over, but it was no longer a one-sided slaughter. Lyra established a medical training program that taught other survivors the skills they would need to treat combat injuries and infection cases. Her experience in Millbrook had shown her that traditional medical protocols were inadequate for the realities of their new world, and she was determined to ensure that future defenders would be better prepared. Phoenix became one of her most dedicated students, his personal experience with amputation making him uniquely qualified to help others facing similar choices. The memorial service for those lost in Millbrook was held on a cold morning in November, with the names of the fallen read aloud as the sun rose over the Alliance base. Orion's sacrifice was remembered with particular honor, his final act having eliminated nearly 300 infected and bought precious time for the evacuation. But even as they mourned their losses, the survivors knew that the dead would want them to keep fighting, to ensure that their sacrifices had meaning. Kairos had been assigned to train new marksmen, passing on the skills that had kept him alive through countless encounters with the infected. His students were eager but inexperienced, young people who had grown up in the post-outbreak world and knew no other reality than constant warfare. He tried to teach them not just how to shoot, but how to maintain their humanity in the face of endless violence. As winter approached, intelligence reports suggested that the infected were preparing for another major offensive, this one targeting the larger survivor settlements that had successfully resisted their previous attacks. The Alliance began preparations for what promised to be the largest battle since the outbreak began, mobilizing every available resource and calling in favors from allied groups across the continent. Zephyr stood on the mall's roof one evening, looking out at the lights of the base and thinking about the children who played in the courtyards below. They had been born into a world of horror, but they were also humanity's future, the generation that would either reclaim the Earth or watch it fall completely to the shadows. The fight that had begun in Millbrook was far from over, but for the first,